Hey guys, Mr. Yaisley here. So we're on to lesson number 10 in chapter 7. All right, and lesson number 10 is talking all about factoring by grouping, right? By grouping. And what factoring by grouping is really just using the greatest common factor method that we talked about in lesson number 9. Right, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to put parentheses around the first two terms and the second two terms, right? The majority of the time, that'll be your first step. Then you're going to factor out within each parenthesis, all right, the greatest common factor of each pair of terms, right? So each one's going to have a different greatest common factor, and that's okay. Now, one thing I do want to remind you of when we're doing this, right, is go ahead and look ahead at your all four terms, because when you're factoring by grouping, you have to have exactly 4 terms. You cannot have 5, you cannot have 3, right? You can't have 2 even, because that's just factoring out a greatest common factor. It's not grouping. So you must have 4 terms. Now, what I would encourage you to do is always look at your 4 terms, all right, and kind of look at them as, do I even have a common factor between the first 2 listed? All right, do I even have a common factor between the second 2 listed? All right, if you do, you can go ahead and factor. If you don't see one in common, all right, then I would encourage you to rearrange it, all right, in order to make sure that both the first grouping and the second grouping both have an easy to find common factor. All right, so let's take a look at example A. So I've got x to the third plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6. Exactly 4 terms, so I can use my grouping method. Now, first thing I want to do is look at my first 2 terms and say, do I have a common factor? I do, all right, doesn't have to be a number, it could just be a variable, and I've got 3 x's here and 2 there, so there's definitely a common factor. Then I want to look at the second 2. I've got 2 x's here, or a 2x and a 6 here. Now, they don't have any x's in common, but they do have a common number. So I'm going to go ahead and factor it as it's written. So I'm going to group these first 2. Then I'm going to group the second 2, including the sign that is in front of the third term, right? That also includes that sign. Now, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor of each grouping that I did. So on the first one, I've got x to the third plus 3x squared. The greatest number they have in common is 1, so I'm not really too worried about that because the coefficient of this x to the third is 1. Right? But they do have multiple x's in common. This one has 3 x's and this one has 2 x's. So they have a common factor, greatest common factor of x to the second power, 2 x's. So then again, I go into my, like I did with my GCF. Well, what did I multiply x squared by to get to x to the third? Well, that would be x. And then what did I multiply x to the third, x squared by to get to 3x squared? Right? Well, that would just be the 3, so positive 3. End of my parentheses. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the second set of parentheses. Now, if I have done this correctly, all right, if I do this correctly, I should end with x plus 3 inside my second set of parentheses as well, right, if I have done this correctly. So let's look at them, 2x and positive 6. Let's start with the numbers. All right, positive 2 and positive 6. What's the greatest number that goes into both? Well, that would be positive 2. So I'm going to list a positive 2 out front, and I need the plus sign. All right, I must put the plus sign. All right, now this one has an x involved, but this one does not, so I can't have an x in my greatest common factor. So that means that I'm done with my greatest common factor, and I should be in my parentheses. Well, what did I multiply positive 2 by to get to positive 2x? Well, that would just be x. Right? And then what did I multiply positive 2 by to get to positive 6? Well, that would be positive 3. And that's the end of my parentheses. Now, again, if I did this correctly, I should have the same thing here as I do here, which I do. All right? So that means that my first parenthesis in my answer is x plus 3, what was there. My second parentheses that I'm going to have is what's listed out front here. So the x squared and the positive 2, and I write it in that exact order. So I write x squared plus 2, end of parentheses. And that's how we factor by grouping. All right, so x plus 3 times x squared plus 2. Now again, if we use the FOIL method, all right, and I'm going to do that out here to the side here in a second, all right, we should end up with what we started with on these 4 terms. All right, we should end up with that at the same. All right, now let's go ahead and do that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and show you that. So x plus 3 times x squared plus 2. Now this one is not going to use the stacking method because this x is different than this x. This one's an x squared and this one's an x. But we can still use the FOIL method. We're just going to end up with 4 different terms. So first term, x times x squared is x to the third. Outer terms, x times positive 2 is positive 2x, right? Inner terms, positive 3 times x squared is positive 3x squared. And then last terms, positive 3 times positive 6 is, times positive 2 is positive 6. Now again, we're not doing the stacking method because these are not the same type of terms. So it was never going to end up working out where we could stack them all and create combined like terms. Now again, when I look at this, does this end up in descending exponent order? It doesn't, so let's get it there. So x to the third plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6. Is that the same as what I started with? X to the thirds, 3x squared, 2x, and 6. It is, so we did factor that one correctly. All right, well, let's take a look at example B here. So example B, again, we want to look at the first 2 terms and make sure they have a common factor, then the second 2 terms. If they don't, we might want to consider rearranging where we can see a common factor in both sets. So on the first one, I've got x squared plus y. That doesn't have anything in common, right? They don't have a number in common greater than 1, right? And they don't have any variables in common. So I want to rearrange this where I see things that are in common. So I notice that I've got x's here, and if I put those together, right, I would also have y's here. So I'm going to rearrange this and write this as, x squared plus x plus y plus xy. All right? And what that's going to allow me to do is when I do my grouping, find my greatest common factors easier. All right? So group my first 2, then group my second 2, including the sign in front of the third term. So the positive stays with the y. Then I'm going to find my greatest common factor in my first one. Well, there's no coefficients listed, so I don't need to worry about a number. The greatest amount of x's in each one of those is just 1x, so I'm going to have an x out front. Well, what did I multiply x by to get to x squared? Well, that would be x. What did I multiply x by to get to x? Well, the only thing you could multiply x by to get to x is just 1. So that would be positive 1. So now again, if I did this correctly, all right, I should end up with x plus 1 inside the second parentheses, right? So let's take a look. What does this one have as a greatest common factor? Well, again, no numbers in common, but they both have y's listed. So I've got a positive y that I'm going to pull out, and then I'm going to list inside parentheses. Well, what did I multiply y by to get to y? Well, the only thing you could is a 1. And then what did I multiply y by to get to xy? Well, the only thing I could is by an x, and I need to put it positive because it's positive. Now again, if we did this correctly, we should have the same thing inside both parentheses, which at first glance doesn't necessarily look like we do. But when you take a really close look at it, is x plus 1 the same as 1 plus x? Well, yeah, it is. It's just one of them's not written in descending exponent order. So we do actually have the same thing inside the parentheses, which means we did this correctly. So my first parentheses here is going to be x plus 1, written in that descending exponent order. My second parentheses is going to be what I see out front here, which is x plus y. So that becomes my second parentheses, so x plus y. So x plus 1 times x plus y is the factored version of this 4-term polynomial. All right, well, I'd encourage you to try example C on your own, then check your answer with mine. I'm going to move my paper up just slightly, and then I'll take a look at it. So when I look at my terms here, I see that my first terms definitely have some A's in common, but my second terms don't have anything in common. So I want to rearrange, right, just to make my life a little easier. Well, I see that there are A's in common with 3 of the terms, so I'm probably going to combine 2 of those, but let's make sure. If I combined, this one with this one, not combined, but I grouped them together, all right, I would notice that this term and this term both have a 3 involved, so they do have a greatest common factor. So if I rewrite it, that'll make my life a little easier. So I'm going to say a to the third plus a plus 3a squared plus 3. So I just rearranged to make my grouping a little easier, right? It's not actually the only way to do it. I could group it as it is, but I see a lot of mistakes when we don't see something to pull out right away. So I always encourage you to rearrange before you do your grouping. So now we're going to group up the first and second term, as well as the third and fourth term, including the sign that's in front of the third term. Now, a to the third plus a, the greatest common factor we have there, no number, but we've got a's involved, but the greatest amount we have involved is just one of them. So I'm going to pull an a out. Well, what did I multiply a by to get to a to the third? Well, that would be a squared. What did I multiply a by to get to a? Well, the only thing I could is by multiplying it by positive 1. All right, so now again, if I did this correctly, that means that this should be inside the second parenthesis at the end. Well, what's the greatest common factor we see here? We do have numbers, and they're both 3's. So positive 3 is definitely the greatest number. This one has a's, but this one doesn't, so I can't pull any a's out. So that means that I'm now into my parentheses. So what did I multiply positive 3 by to get to positive 3a squared? Well, positive 3 times 1 equals positive 3. A squared is all I have left, so I'm just going to put my a squared. Well, then what did I multiply positive 3 by to get to positive 3? Well, again, the only thing I could do that by is positive 1 to get there. Now, again, if I did my grouping correctly, right, I should have the same thing inside parentheses, which I do. So there's my first parentheses, so a squared plus 1 is my first parentheses. My second parentheses is what's out front here, so a plus 3. So I'm going to put that a plus 3 as my second parentheses. All right, well, hope you got that correct. Now I'd encourage you to try example D on your own, then check your answer with mine. So again, when I look at example D, I don't see anything in common between these first 2 terms, so I'm going to rearrange. I see that these 2's are in common, so I'm going to group those 2 together. So that means that I should have y squared plus yx, and then plus 2x plus 2y. I see something in common here, as well as something in common there, so I'm going to go ahead and group up, including on the third term the sign that's in front of it. Now, what's the greatest common factor of y squared and yx? Well, this has y's and this has y's, but this doesn't have any x's. So only going to be y's involved here. So I'm going to pull out one y, because that's the greatest amount that's in both. Well, what did I multiply y by to get to y squared? Well, that would just be y. What did I multiply y by to get to yx? That would just be x, so positive x. All right, now again, if I did this correctly, I should end up with the same thing as I do here in the second parenthesis. Well, these both have numbers, so I'm going to pull out a number. The number that's in common is obviously 2. That's what's listed, so positive 2 is going to be pulled out. And then what did I have an x here, but no x here. I have a y here, but no y here, so I can't pull out any variables. So I need to put my parentheses. Well, what did I multiply positive 2 by to get to positive 2x? That would be just x. And what did I multiply positive 2 by to get to positive 2y? Well, again, that would just be positive y into parentheses. Now, again, at first glance, it doesn't look like I have the same thing inside parentheses. but y plus x is the same as x plus y. So I actually do have the same thing inside parentheses. So that is my first one, and I'm going to write it as x plus y because I like alphabetical order. So x plus y is my first parenthesis. My second parenthesis, what's out front here? So y plus 2. So x plus y times y plus 2 is my final factors of my grouping. So that would be my final answer. Well, if you have any additional questions about this process, please let me know. Otherwise, you should have what you need to continue on in the chapter.